Good afternoon, I'm Karlene Cabaraban, and the last three presentations of this session gave us a lot of insight on improving life expectancies and the social dimensions of health and health behaviors. And I believe they provided a good introduction for my presentation this afternoon. Because as people live longer, the event of becoming widowed is also being pushed to the older ages on average, which is a phenomenon that is remarkably different from how it was like centuries ago. And this makes us wonder, what does marital dissolution mean for healthy aging? And my presentation today touches on this line of inquiry, but paying special focus on one specific dimension of healthy aging, which is cognition. This work is being done together with Valeria Borduna of the University of Vienna and Daniela Weber of IASA as part of the KIAS project, which stands for Cognitive Health in an Aging Society. And this project broadly looks at heterogeneities in cognitive health among older Europeans and seeks to investigate what are the drivers of these heterogeneities in cognitive health. In my presentation this afternoon, we will explore a potential source of heterogeneity that has been relatively under-investigated in the marital dissolution cognition literature. And more specifically, we will look at how such an association varies between men and women in Europe. So this presentation is divided into three parts. First, we will look at the broader theoretical and conceptual frameworks that guide our research objectives. Second, I will briefly outline the data and methods from which our analyses are drawn. And third, but not the least, we will consider some of the preliminary results, which may give us some insight also on the extent to which marital dissolution may matter for cognitive functioning in the older ages. So at the end of my presentation, I look forward to hearing some other insights and some relevant feedback as well that could help improve on this work in progress. So we begin by asking, why do heterogeneities in cognitive functioning exist in the first place? We generally expect cognitive functioning to decline with increasing age. But an important research discovery to emerge in the past several decades is that age-related declines in cognition are not experienced equally within and across populations. In the neuroscience and socio-gerontological literature, cognition in the older ages is broadly conceptualized as an accumulation of cognitive reserve built up through engagement in cognitively stimulating activities at various stages of the life course. However, cognitive reserve varies from person to person, and this is mostly because different subgroups are generally afforded unequal opportunities for cognitive reserve accumulation. In this regard, the literature identifies two important sources of heterogeneity across many measures of cognitive functioning. First, we have marital status, and second, labor market participation. However, it's worth noting that marital status and labor market participation may be closely intertwined. For instance, in traditional marriages, husbands and wives typically allocate work activities along the dimension of gender. And in such a model, husbands take on the responsibility of the family's primary breadwinner, and wives assume the responsibility of homemaking or caregiving in the family. In this regard, such gender-based marital roles are expected to have some bearing on wives' participation in the labor market, resulting in gender inequalities in cognitive reserve accumulation. So one could therefore speculate that such gender inequalities in cognitive reserve accumulation may reinforce gaps in late-life cognition between older adults who remain in the marital relationship versus those who exit this relationship through divorce or widowhood. The association between marital dissolution and cognition among adults in mid and late life is well documented. Basically, the findings indicate that married people do report better cognition compared to divorced or widowed adults. However, findings with regard to gender differences and other differences across various factors have been mixed. And it also shows variation in what particular measures of cognitive functioning were employed in the analysis, as well as regional contexts. So in some studies, there's no significance, and in some studies, there is some significance. And for instance, widowhood may have a greater impact on individuals' cognition in contexts where married couples generally structure engagement in cognitively stimulating activities such as participation in community activities and employment around the marital relationship. On the other hand, an important gap in the literature is that these studies generally focus on marital histories and employment separately and fail to consider how these two might intersect to influence cognition later on. As such, our study contributes to the literature by going beyond the marital dissolution cognition link and looking at whether an individual's work status or work activity has implications for cognitive functioning among older adults, specifically older adults who transition to widowhood and older adults who remain within the marital relationship and thus benefit still from the spousal safety net of support we generally assume are afforded by marriage. And in this slide, you will see our research objectives and our conceptual framing. So, first, we examine the association between marital dissolution, in particular widowhood, and two measures of cognitive functioning, which I will describe later on. Second, we assess the potential role played by work status in reinforcing marital status gaps in late life cognitive functioning. And third, we consider how cognitive functioning heterogeneities across work status between married adults versus widowers and widows vary by gender and also by education. So, as I mentioned earlier, we examined two measures of cognitive functioning, namely episodic memory and verbal fluency. So the variable representing episodic memory was created by computing the sum of scores in two recall tasks in SHARE. So in the dataset that we used, a list of 10 words was read aloud to each participant, and each participant was asked to recall as many of these words as they could twice. So first, immediately afterwards, which is called immediate recall, and after a standardized delay or delayed recall. And for the verbal fluency tasks in the dataset, each participant was asked to name as many animals as possible within 60 seconds. So there are many measures of cognitive functioning, and our choice of these two measures is motivated by two reasons. Firstly, previous studies have found that recall and fluency tasks are the most sensitive to cognitive aging. And second, these two measures best capture the crystallized or knowledge and fluid intelligence components of cognition. For our independent variables, we mainly focus on marital dissolution, specifically widowhood. It's a time-varying characteristic, and how it interacts with work status to influence our two measures of cognitive functioning. So essentially, we compare individuals who become widowed with those who remained married or partnered, and the retired and the homemakers with those who were currently engaged in paid work. Lastly, we explore whether there are any significant variations by gender and by education. So I won't go into it further in the interest of time, but for our measure of education, we account for differences in the meaning of education across European countries by incorporating a relative measure of education. So our analyses are drawn from 6 waves of SHARE, as I mentioned earlier, specifically waves 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. And for those of us here who are not familiar with SHARE, it's a panel survey on adults aged 50 plus, covering about 28 countries in Europe. So we analyzed information from respondents who were aged 50 plus when they first participated in SHARE and were interviewed in at least 2 waves. We consider only those who were married or in a registered partnership when they were first interviewed. The reason for this is so we could focus on how the change from being in a married state to an unmarried one is associated with changes in cognitive functioning. And to accomplish our research objectives, we employ fixed effects regression for panel data, adjusting for clustering at the individual level, and control for age, survey waves, and number of reported difficulties in activities of daily living. Based on our preliminary results, we do see a significant association between becoming widowed and changes in cognitive functioning. In this graph, you will see that on average, men who become widowed perform poorly in the verbal fluency tasks, even after we add our controls in the fixed effects model. Looking at the green triangle representing the fixed effects coefficients for the interaction term between widowhood and work status, we can observe a reverse in the direction. The positive coefficient indicates that widowers who are retired exhibit better verbal fluency than those who are still working. Although the width of the error bar suggests that this association is not that large. We further stratify our analysis by considering gender differentials between the low education and the high education group. Again, we can see a significant interaction between widowhood and work status. In particular, poor verbal fluency can be observed among male homemakers who later on experience losing their spouse. However, this association was not found to be significant for the high education group. So what do our preliminary results tell us? So widowhood has negative implications for verbal fluency, which is a measure that captures crystallized or knowledge components of cognition that people have accumulated over their lifetime. But this association was only significant for men, especially the low-educated. However, while our results do show some gender and educational differences, it's not that much. So for our next steps, we will also consider other potential subgroup heterogeneities, such as the respondent's age upon first joining SHARE, and we also wanted to consider their birth year cohort as well. So we will also explore other factors and see whether they also play an important role. For instance, in the literature, there are studies which show that the death of a spouse could be more stressful to the bereaved if the death occurred unexpectedly, as opposed to whether it was more or less anticipated because their spouse had reported a chronic illness earlier on in the study. And according to stress models, the stress from such an unexpected loss could have some negative implications on cognition. And on that note, I would like to conclude my presentation by thanking the Wittgenstein Center for allowing me this opportunity to present our work. And yeah, thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions and feedback.